Yeah, I think it's HRI is a really interesting area. It also kind of has like a lot of sub areas, connections with HCI, connections with human factors. And so yeah, I think there's a lot to discover still.
Welcome to another episode of HFIG Talks, a podcast produced by the Human Factors Interest Group at the University of Toronto. In this episode, we talk to Professor Jamy Li, an assistant professor in the Department of Mechanical and Industrial Engineering at Ryerson University. Professor Li specializes in the field of human-robot interaction and conducts research on a variety of different areas such as socially assistive robots and voice assistants. In this conversation, Professor Li discusses his background and his current research, the links between human-robot interaction and human factors, and his thoughts on how research in human-robot interaction will evolve moving forward.
So my name is Jamy Li. I am currently an assistant professor in the Mechanical and Industrial Engineering program at Ryerson University. And my background is at U of T. I did my master's and bachelor's there in engineering science and industrial engineering. And I did my PhD at Stanford in communication research. During my master's at U of T, I did a internship at Keio University in Japan. And they had these robotic teddy bear phones. So yes, there were robots in the shape of teddy bears that also had phone ability. So I did an experiment about how people could kind of communicate using the gestures of this robot bear. So that's kind of how I got started. That was the first study I did with HRI.
Yeah, and then what basically led you to want to pursue a career in that field?
I guess I thought it was like an interesting field. It was kind of like an emerging field, and yeah, I didn't I didn't see that it was, I don't know, like solved or something like that. So I thought there was a lot of potential, especially because robots, can be important technology devices in the future. So how people interact with that, there's still some open questions about that. So part of it was like chance based on the project that I worked on, and then part of it was also that has kind of perhaps like a promising kind of area that mixes a bit of engineering and a bit of psychology and social space.
Yeah, for sure. And what applications of this field are you particularly interested in with your research right now?
So right now I'm interested in applications with special populations. So especially elderly persons and those from minority groups. Also kind of collaboration with industries. So whether there's like schools or elderly care centers to see how robots can assist them. And I'm mostly working with socially assistive robots. So yeah, there's kind of, I guess like two general groups, which is one is more like functional, like physically assistive, like exoskeletons and stuff like that. And one is more like socially assistive, where, it's providing information or telling jokes or agenda setting or, motivation type thing. So I'm working more with the socially assistive ones for special populations.
Yeah, so I'm interested, you mentioned that you're working with groups like elderly people, but also other minority groups. So can you elaborate a bit more on how you think, for example, socially assistive robots can help these particular groups?
So for elderly, there could be like more functional assistance, like reminders, telling jokes, playing music. For example, there was like a startup at Ryerson that I heard of that was like giving older older adults like music, like they put their favorite songs and stuff like that, so that can kind of boost their mood. So part of it can be like those kind of activities, and then part of it could also be like voice enabled activities. So more like Amazon Alexa type activities where they're actually kind of having more like conversation. So it could be a little bit more like a little bit more like social elements, or it could be more just like the functional, it's going to play music, or it's going to, issue reminders.
It's really interesting. I think there are a lot of cool applications for that kind of technology. Can you give an example of an interesting finding from some of these studies or your research work that you've been doing?
Yeah, some of the robot research I've done, I did look at kind of the human-robot interaction, like the role of the robot and the role of the person. Because there's different, I guess, when like people interact with other people, there's different types of role. Like one person could be more subordinate, the other person could be more dominant. Whereas with the robot, it's not really clear how the robot should be, especially if it is like a humanoid robot or has like some social features. So again, this is more for like the social side, not necessarily for a robot that is a robotic wheelchair or something like that. It's more for like, when there's actually conversation or some sort of agency. So I did some studies about that. And I did find that people generally didn't respond well to a robot that was kind of dominant or like, kind of higher status, higher position than the person. So they generally preferred robots to be more like subordinate to people. Showing people, for example, videos of a robot and a person. When the robot's dominant, the person's subordinate, they actually don't like the robot and they also don't like the person compared to when, it's the other way around. So there is some sort of, perhaps like special considerations when it is a robot versus a person. So that's one example. I can think of.
That is really interesting. Like I'm wondering if that was observed like across the board for like all sorts of participants, or were there any particular characteristics of people who didn't like that interaction or that kind of relationship, or I don't know, maybe that there could be different, factors that could influence how people perceive that kind of interaction, right?
Right. Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. Yeah. Especially because there is some evidence that some people who are maybe more like depending on their personality, they may want, for example, like a complementary personality with the robot. Yeah, so that's something that study, for example, didn't really look at. However, that definitely could be something that there definitely might be individual differences. This one is more just like the averages, like the general like statistical differences. So it was more like quantitative as opposed to qualitative. So I think the qualitative would definitely come up with more like individual variation. Yeah.
Another question that I think might be related to this subject is, what do you think is the role of emotion in human-robot interaction?
Yeah, I think emotion has a really large, well, maybe not large, but very, I guess, very like interesting role in a way, because robots, they do have a lot of, I would say they have a lot of like media presence too, and the concept of a robot. So there's definitely something that some people find interesting or appealing about emotions and robots. Do robots have emotions and stuff? So it raises kind of like some interesting questions. I think on the research side, there's more like, maybe there's like two different areas. One is like people expressing emotions toward robots. For example, more like ethnographic studies or something like that, where they're looking at, how much do people actually connect or express emotions towards robots, even robots that aren't necessarily designed to be social. So in my research, I'm more doing things that like with the shoulder robot, where it's like talking to you or like gesturing at you. And there's also, for example, mind diffusing robots, which are not designed to have any sort of communication. but there have been studies that have shown like actually people sometimes do form some sort of connection with the mind diffusing robot based on the fact that it is saving people's lives. Of course, it's not to the level of an actual human being. However, it is more than just the level of a sponge or something like that, right? So it is kind of an interesting kind of variation, how intelligence is actually affecting people's emotions toward the object. Even though they know it's not a real object.
Yeah.
So I think that's the one interesting. And then the other area is also just like, how robots can express emotions to people. So that one might be useful for like entertainment purposes. Like it's gonna smile a certain way, or going to have smiley faces or comedic sad faces or whatever. And it could also be for example, some people who may have difficulty with processing emotions to kind of help teach them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm wondering if you might observe people who are a bit more like apprehensive or afraid of a robot that is showing too much emotion, or like would they think that it's too much like a human, or have this, I don't know, like uncanny valley effect, where they think, it's very human-like, but also I know it's kind of a machine and it's not real. So I'm wondering if that has also been observed.
Yeah, that's definitely a big question in HRI is kind of the uncanniness, and also like comparison with people, how would people react with robots? I think that's kind of still a bit of an unanswered question. Like the Uncanny Valley, there definitely are cases where people are reporting that this is really it is kind of very human-like, and it kind of makes people feel kind of uneasy, or like that the system is kind of odd. Again, kind of like what we were saying before, it might have something to do with some individual differences, and also kind of like the application of the robot and like the specific design of a specific robot. So I think there isn't like at least from my understanding, there isn't like a set answer yet. It kind of depends, like you said, on individual differences and the robot.
Yeah, for sure. And I think maybe even like the context or how it's going to be used, I believe,
right,
might even affect that. So this is, a human factors podcast. And I think your background is also somewhat related to human factors if you have a master's in industrial engineering. But, these two fields, human factors and human robot interaction are very like interconnected. So what do you think is the relationship between human robot interaction as a field and human factors?
So I think in HRI, there are some computer science background people. So and also some like roboticists people. So some of the focus in HRI is kind of developing like robot prototypes, which might be future looking and not necessarily like in industry. So for example, like humanoid robots, in my research, I've used some humanoid robots, like the Now robot, which, they aren't really that widespread. And it's kind of more like developing a prototype for it. So I think that one thing that is a nice connection between human factors is that human factors has a lot of experience with like actual industrial use of robots. So for example, like UAV, there's like a lot of UAV research, like military robots that are actually in I'd say like in widespread use. So I think that kind of complements each other in a way. Because sometimes the HRI prototypes are more like trying to be like future looking, and kind of what is what could it look like if we had delivery robots everywhere, for example. So I think it's a nice complement because there are some like computer science topics like like perception, for example, in HRI, and HRI can also connect with kind of the more human factors approach on things like, situation awareness, like trust. There's a lot of like trust in robotics issues that I think have really connected like human factors and HRI.
Yeah. And I think maybe also one other connection or similarity or common theme is the methodology for how the research is conducted. Maybe like how experiments are designed, although I'm not really aware of how these experiments that conduct on human-robot interaction are designed or are conducted. So, but there might be some similar approaches in terms of just like the methodology.
Yeah, there's definitely like a certain rigor to kind of like the quantitative and also like the qualitative methods. And it is a little bit more like, yeah, I guess like scientific usually. I mean, there are also more like qualitative studies as well. But yeah, in terms of methods, a lot of them are really like, user or operator centered. And some of it is also kind of like more like theoretical and stuff like that, but trying to be like rigorous in that way. So yeah, I think that's good too.
So yeah, where do you see the field of human-robot interaction heading in the future? It could be just in general or particularly your research.
Well, in general, I think, based on my opinion, also, opinion of some colleagues and other people I know in the field who have given talks about it. And my own talks, I guess, as well. I think one area is kind of like smooth collaboration between people and robots. So I think that's kind of a big area, which also overlaps a lot with like the current like buzzwords in AI, like explainability and interpretability and like fairness and stuff like that. Because I think there's also a lot of examples where people don't really understand how robots work, and as a result, the interaction doesn't go very smoothly. So one example is, for example, like a robot that's trying to open a door. Some people who, apparently some people, who are even engineers, they'll want to help the robot. So they'll try to like open the door for the robot. But in that process, it actually causes the robot to have to rescan the whole, because it detected there's movement in front of it. So then it actually has to take twice as long because it now needs to rescan the whole door. So that kind of indicates like the people don't really understand, how a robot works. It's not like a toaster, right? Everyone has an understanding of a toaster. I mean, unless you're like you're like very young, but most people they know how a toaster works, right? So there's no method of confusion. But with the robot, they don't. Another example is like robots that are like delivering items that are on the street. So now those are more common. And like people will like step in front of the robot to kind of be like observing it and like kind of checking it out and stuff like that, which actually prevents it from crossing the street. So sometimes people don't really understand, or they kind of behave in ways that actually kind of hinder its operation. So I kind of think of that like, in AI, there's the idea of like the black box, like AI is in black box, how we interpret it. And I think robotics is kind of like a literal black box, because sometimes the robots are actually black boxes and people don't really have an understanding of what's kind of inside the black box. So I think that kind of like ways to solve that would be things like intent communication. So for like autonomous vehicles or any sort of robot, like how is it communicating its intent on one hand, and another hand is kind of like the explainability, like the mental model that the person has, their understanding of like what are the functions of the robot. Does it have a perception module? Like kind of how is it kind of programmed to operate? So I think that's one area, like kind of smooth collaboration. I think some other areas just, this might be a bit random, but I think voice is also kind of a big area for HRI, especially because like Amazon Alexa and Google Voice and all these voice systems are kind of becoming more popular. And I think on the design side, there's still a lot of questions about that. Voice right now is very much like a transactional interaction where they have like an intent, and then the system has like an intent specification, and then it keeps on asking questions until you get to a specific intent specification level, and then boom, it operates, it performs the operation. However, when people talk, they don't necessarily talk, like, oh, do you want, what song do you want? Or something. Like, people don't necessarily talk that way. So, for different applications, how are we going to design voice? So one of the projects that I was working on, a student group, was kind of taking like a plant robot and then putting a conversational agent inside it. And I was trying to do like behavioral activation therapy. So kind of how to structure that that interaction. Would like the robot be initiating? Would the person be initiating? What kind of those conversations would look like? Not necessarily under the umbrella of the Amazon Alexa kind of style, but if there could be more open options to kind of how that conversation would happen.
Yeah, so you basically mean trying to make this conversation more natural and less kind of like, because when I interact with these voice assistants, it just feels like I'm just giving commands like play music or tell me what's on my calendar for today. So I guess what like a future thing would be making these interactions more like a real conversation.
Yeah, I think that can definitely be, I would say that definitely would open the avenue for more types of applications. Yeah, because it would be difficult to have like, for example, the conversation that we're having now in a way where it's kind of like an intense specification type thing, I think. So in terms of like one of the I guess the anecdotes I think of when I think about voice assistants is that if you actually have a human assistant, you would never, like, for example, you never call a human that gives a lecture, a human, sorry, not a human, a robot that gives a lecture, a robot professor, because as a professor, you do a lot of different things. You don't just, give a speech. So similarly, like if you actually have an assistant, in the department assistant or something, they do a lot more stuff than just answer questions and ask you questions, or tell you the time or something like that. Like they have like, they gather information about, the social context, and they also do a lot of interpretation. Like if you say, okay, I need to reach somebody, they don't just, initiate the call. They like could initiate the call, but they also take into account like, okay, well, where the person is. Instead of initiating the call, they might be like, okay, well, I can contact them with email or call or go to their office. And, with different people, they're better, this professor kind of, really responds well to email, whereas this other professor, you need to go to the office. So they have a lot more like context and a lot more ability than the current voice assistants, which is just, I'm looking up in a database and I initiate the call. Because like human assistants don't actually just do it that simply. They have a lot more like ability than that. So I think one direction for it, I mean, I think voice assistants are very strong for what they do, like setting a timer, for example. There's no better way to set a timer. It's like a very great way to set a timer. I think they have a lot of potential with when we're kind of factoring in that there's a lot of different kind of structures for voice communication that are available to people.
Yeah, and what do you think are some of the challenges for that? Obviously, it's a very challenging problem to get, a voice assistant or just any sort of automation to become more like a human and like make these assumptions based on context or based on different rules. So based on your knowledge and your research, what do you think are some of the challenges and concerns about that?
I think one challenge might be just how much to structure the conversations. So I think that there definitely is a lot of benefit to having some structure to conversations because, kind of in line with the collaboration between people and robots, this is kind of the connection I see with HRI, it's helpful to have like a mental model to be able to understand like how the interaction will go. So I think, for example, roles are very helpful because roles, when you identify a role for the object or the robot, or the voice agent, then it kind of gives people like a bit of a context on like how they're going to interact with them, the system. So I think, yeah, one of the challenges would probably be identifying the level of like the structure. So kind of what kind of structure the interaction would have. I think another challenge are things like the interpretability and explainability. So either training people to, or using the kind of the role moniker to be able to kind of help people understand how the interaction will go. I think people, I think with the question and answer, it's quite, maybe that's quite, one advantage of it is that it's quite easy for people to understand what the interaction will be like, because they're just kind of answering questions. So I think with the kind of a more complex or more open-ended kind of formats, then it would be helpful for people to know, to have some sort of communication or some sort of training or some sort of, indicator or prompt to kind of be able to shape that.
Yeah, I think that, so many of these problems are really interesting, even to me personally. I think, even with a simple interaction with like this voice assistant, and then it decides, like if you ask it to call someone and then it decides based on what it knows that actually this person isn't really reachable by phone a lot, so I'd rather just send them an email. I think it would be important to communicate to the person who's asking why it decided to send an email instead, right? Like, so that's kind of part of that explainability or interpretability, right? So that would be kind of one of the challenges, but also maybe one other difficulty would be, like, why is it telling me too much information? Maybe, like, I think it's just balancing the amount of information that it's telling the user to make it interpretable or explainable, but also not telling them too much that they don't really need to know, like not explaining every single decision that it's making.
Yeah, that's a big research point too. Yeah, there's definitely some studies, for example, with like autonomous vehicles as well, where they're kind of, it's not just the amount, but it's also the type. So for example, with autonomous vehicles, they're also making a lot of decisions autonomously. And so what information are you going to give to the rider/driver? And so some of it is like, do you give the information before it does the action? Do you give it after it does the action? And what kind of information do you do? You kind of give like a rationale for, do you just give a explanation? For example, I'm turning left, so you know it's turning left. Or do you give a, I'm turning left because of, this is the reason, because I saw the sign. Or do you just give the, I saw the sign, so there's like, there's maybe like 3 different options. And then their study actually found that people don't like it when they give too much information. So that would be definitely aligned with what you're saying. Yeah, because they didn't rate it well when it gives both the action it's doing and also the rationale. Probably kind of like what you're saying, because it's just too much information.
Yeah, that is actually my area of research. So like I do study, like driving automation systems and how people interact with them. So that's always interesting to me. And like it is particularly on display design, or like how to communicate information to the driver. So I'm always interested in learning more about, the theory behind how to make things more interpretable, or what kind of information to present to the user. So that's why.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Yeah, like also with like privacy and stuff like that. That's just a whole other area.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting area of research. Yeah, in terms of like what to present to them that makes them like a good level of their understanding. And with privacy, a lot of it is based on like public opinion polls. I think one other open question is kind of how that actually translates to people when they actually get the device, and when they're actually kind of using it. And I think privacy is definitely a big issue, because also part of it is also like maybe the quality of the system as well, because if it actually is a robust system where like the privacy actually is preserved, then it's not necessarily an issue. However, it might not be 100% foolproof, or not foolproof, but hack proof.
I think all of these factor into those conversation about trust, or like that trust of the automated system or the robot. Because when you were earlier discussing things like, oh, the robot is supposed to be opening a door or closing a door, when people decide to help the robot, it's a sign of like a lack of trust or distrust. But that also makes that whole interaction less effective or less efficient, right? So privacy might also play a role in that.
Yeah, because if they're helping the robot, maybe it is because they don't necessarily trust it to do the right thing or be able to do it. Yeah, I guess if it were designed to be more like trustworthy or even just like communicate that it's doing it, then maybe people would kind of be able to interact with it more smoothly, where they don't actually kind of try to compensate for it or something like that. So yeah, I think Human Factors also has quite a lot of literature on the trust, like appropriate levels of trust too. So for me, I was kind of thinking it's like more like the understanding of how the robot is operating, because they wouldn't do that if, however, I kind of see what you're saying too. It's like, it could also just be their kind of trust, because even if they understand that, they might have understood that, but they might not kind of trust that it actually is going to get to the right decision. So then they're going to help them as well. So
yeah, I think there are just too many different factors. Like trust might be one, but also just an inappropriate mental model of how it works, or just a lack of knowledge about how it works. They think that they're helping it if they're doing something. Like they think that would make the process or interaction smoother when it actually doesn't. So yeah, these are all very interesting research questions for sure. Is there anything else that you would like to tell our listeners? Any thoughts or comments, or just, anecdotes that you would like to tell?
Yeah. So yeah. Well, thank you very much, Adina, for interviewing me. And I think it's HRI is a really interesting area. It also kind of has like a lot of sub areas with HCI connections, with HCI connections, with human factors. A lot of the technical component and other components. So yeah, I think there's a lot to discover still for in HRI.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm really glad that you agreed to join this interview, and I learned a lot from it. I think there's a lot of unanswered questions in this field, and there's just a lot of promise in terms of research for sure.
Thank you to Professor Jamy Li for this interesting conversation. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and stay tuned for new episodes coming soon.